My name is Imad Harb. I am the Director of Research and Analysis at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Today, the Arab world is going through some really wrenching times, times of change, times of conflict. But in a way, these conflicts are, yes, they are the creation of, present conditions, but they also are a resultant of, it's the Arab world's history and development. With us today is Elizabeth Thompson. She's a professor of history at American University, and she is the author of the book, How the West Stole Democracy, the Syrian Arab Congress of 1920 and the destruction of its Historic Liberal-Islamic Alliance. A big title for a very, very important, important book. Dr. Thompson is, as I said, is a professor of history at American University. She is the chair of the Mohamed Farsi chair of Islamic Peace at American University. She is a historian of political movements, constitutionalism, gender, and foreign intervention in the Middle East. She's also the author of two other books, Justice Interrupted, The Struggle for a Constitutional Government in the Middle East, from Harvard University Press in 2013, and Colonial Citizens, Republican Rights, Paternal Privilege, and Gender in French Syria and Lebanon, from Columbia University Press in 2000. Dr. Thompson, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you.
This is your book, and your book is really chock full of details. It's a very, very comprehensive look at the development of basically the Arab Revolt, the Eastern Mediterranean countries, today's countries of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, as well as partly the Arabian Peninsula. And this book covers the period when basically the forces that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula to end the Ottoman Empire's control of the area and forged north to control Syria, and their attempt to basically establish an Arab independent Syrian kingdom. I think in many places, it's some people called it the United States of Syria, or the United Kingdoms of Syria, anyway. This was the origin was to establish some sort of a constitutional monarchy. And Prince Faisal, the son of Sharif Hussein, the king of Hijaz at the time, had led the Arab forces into Syria and helped establish such a state, although that establishment was really very, very short-lived, and it ended almost immediately after it was announced. I just thought that we just concentrate on some themes instead of the details of it, but this is an idea that emerged from the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Now, the Arabs at the time decided that maybe this is the time to really rid ourselves of occupation and colonialism in the form of the Ottoman Empire and establish ourselves as an independent nation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Obviously, the European powers were not necessarily very, very happy about it. They had always spoiled to take over the sick man of Europe that the Ottoman Empire used to be called. But they never really went ahead and destroyed the Ottoman Empire until World War I. Now, why did the European not want the Eastern Mediterranean region to be independent?
Well, the simplest, and I think the truest, simplest, and most profound reason is that Britain needed the oil in Iraq. I'm sorry to say it. Right. It's a kind of cliche since the Gulf War that that's the real reason the West goes to war in the region. But as many sources as I combed through over the period of about 6 years, always came back to that motive, right? That They had converted their navy to petroleum in 1911. They had run short of oil during the war, as did France. And so after the war, they wanted to occupy Mesopotamia, as they called it, in order to gain their very own oil fields, all right, that they would have sovereignty over. Second, of course, as time went on, they became very concerned that the more advanced Arabs, meaning Arabs who were clearly able to rule themselves and to build a modern democratic style government, would inspire Arabs already under colonization in North Africa and Muslims in India to demand independence from the colonial empires that both the British and the French ruled. So those are the two reasons.
Yeah, well, there were other things as well, right? I mean, we're talking about the Sykes-Picot agreement was already signed in 1916. The Balfour Declaration in November of 1917. So, how much influence did these two agreements, so to speak, have on the ultimate aim of not helping this independent state to come through?
The Ottomans had no interest in seeing independent Arabs.
I'm sorry, not the Ottomans. I mean the two agreements, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration. How prominent were they in British and French plans not to allow the Syrians to really have an independent state?
Yes, there's a whole game. The Paris Peace Conference, which began in January 1919,
correct,
has been described as a laboratory of fabricating a new world order based on international law, thanks to Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points and so on. And the British and the French used the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Accord as cornerstones of that law, that you could not go back on them. If we're going to have a world based on law, we cannot go back on our treaties, right? So that put the Arabs in a box, and they had to argue against that notion of a kind of unilateral or bilateral, if you will, organizing of the world through treaties amongst the great powers on behalf of or against the will of third parties, colonial people, right? Woodrow Wilson, interestingly, as bad as his reputation is in the United States for his racial segregation in Washington, D.C. and so on, understood that and fought it. The thing that astonished me most in writing the book is that Wilson engaged in his most bitter fights at the Paris Peace Conference, aside from fights on Germany and reparations, about Syria. Syria was the most contested issue because that was the cornerstone of his vision to see a world built on international law through the participation of the peoples involved, what he called self-determination, right? So he even sent an American delegation out to Syria to have it collect Syrians' views of how they wanted to be governed after the war.
Right. That's the King Crane Commission.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and the King Crane Commission came back with a report that I don't think anybody really read because of domestic conditions in the United States. That whatever their findings were, nobody really knew about them, right?
This was a delegation ultimately sent on the authority of Woodrow Wilson. And King and Crane felt bound to keep it secret until the day that Woodrow Wilson would authorize its publication. But Wilson had a stroke at the end of September 1919. And so the US Congress proceeded to vote on the Versailles Treaty and chose not to join the League of Nations without ever seeing this report, to the benefit of the British and French, who just put their copies of the report in a drawer and under lock and key.
I want to go back a little bit, backwards a little bit, a few years back. I mean, the Sharif Hussein had, honestly, I mean, he's from the Arabian Peninsula. What really prompted this push to think of himself, or his son, for that matter, being the ruler of Syria, considering that, in the Hijaz, he was really fighting Ibn Saud. He was really fighting for his control of his own area. I mean, was that really just simply the British really cheated him to start to help them to kick the Ottomans out of the Arabian Peninsula and of Syria, and promised him that, or was there really a deeper relation that Sharif Hussein could claim to Syria?
His relationship to Syria was really through the person of Faisal, his son.
Right.
I think if you look at the date that the Arab Revolt began in June of 1916,
right.
It followed a year of negotiations with the British that had begun in the fall of 1915, all right, before Sykes-Picot drew up their accord,
right?
Right, but was prompted by reports.
McMahon correspondence, right?
Yes, it was prompted, and as far as we can tell in the sources that survive, his interest in contacting the British High Commissioner in Cairo about cooperation with a revolt against the Ottomans and seeking an independent Arab state. Out of that came from reports of the ways in which the Turkish military dictatorship was treating Arabs in Syria. I have come to, there are long debates about this period. And in my study, I've come to side with those who believe that at the beginning there were strong ties to a group in Syria called Fatah, right? A nationalist group, and that Faisal had joined that group in his visits to Damascus, and that the revolt was supposed to, first conceived to be, a popular revolt uniting Arabs living north in Syria with Arabs in this Arabian Peninsula. But the Turks broke into the French embassy and found documents and hanged many of the leaders of Fatah who would have led that revolt. And so the modality of the revolt shifted to look like it was a Bedouin tribal revolt of the old-fashioned kind against the Ottoman Sultan. But I found those who survived the executions of 1915 and 1916 actually remained in contact with Sharif Hussein and his sons, and had prepared for the day that the revolt would enter Damascus in victory. So.
What the Ottomans did to the Lebanese and Syrians was unconscionable. Just what they did to the Armenians as well was also unconscionable. I'd like to also touch a little bit. You have bits and pieces here and there on Ibn Saud, and how Ibn Saud was actually he was the existential threat to Sharif Hussein in Hijaz. Ibn Saud was expanding, and but yet at the same time, the British were dealing with both at the same time. The British, the office in India was dealing with Ibn Saud, and the office in Cairo was dealing with Sharif Hussein. I mean, were they in cahoots? I mean, the two offices were in cahoots. They knew what they were doing, or was each one of them trying to find a foothold, so to speak, an influence on one party or the other in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I find no reason to disagree with the findings of David Fromkin in his book, A Peace to End All Peace. published,
Right.
you know, what, 30 years ago now?
Yeah.
Right, that there was a rivalry within the British Imperial administration, a rivalry between the Foreign Office and the India Office,
Right.
right? And that there was not a rational plan. There were ambitious British officials on both sides,
Right.
seeking to advance their control over the territories liberated from the Ottoman Empire. So the India Office wanted to expand through Iraq into
Right.
the Gulf area and
Yeah.
so on. And then those in Cairo, of course, had their own interests to pursue. So I don't see a conspiracy to orchestrate that rivalry. Sharif Hussein was not a good ruler in his own, in the Hejaz. He was not well liked.
Right.
Ibn Saud was able to draw a much more loyal following than he. And so it is, you know, we can't talk about counterfactuals in history, but it could have been predicted that in the end, Sharif Hussein would be defeated, right? Regardless of what the British did.
You know, with the 2020 hindsight, and you know the success of Ibn Saud, the rise of Ibn Saud obviously was ominous, and he really was able to get all those tribes behind him and really push for primacy. Also, well, you know, with the 2020 hindsight, you know, you'd think that, you know, it's only like 20, 30 years later, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire ceased to exist. I mean, and they did what they did in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then they were gone. It's really very, very interesting. I wanted to just touch a little bit also on the issue of the mandates themselves.
Okay.
Now, the British and the French also, they were rivals, obviously, and the French really resented that the British would even, you know, impinge on their supposed right to really be in Syria and today's Syria and Lebanon. And they really fought each other a lot about this. But, you know, tell me a little more about the involvement of the Lebanese Christians, specifically Patriarch Hwayik, and the establishment of a mandated area of independent Lebanon that by 1926 was actually the Republic of Lebanon was established as a Republic of Lebanon.
The role of in the role of the Lebanese Christians in the final settlement of
precisely, yeah. I mean, you know, pushing for the mandate and later on really affirming it and keeping it going.
Right. You know, the Maronite Church had been frustrated after 1860. It was denied control over Mount Lebanon,
right.
But it remained very close to the French and a partner with the French, and was able to use the fact that the French did not come to the rescue of hundreds of thousands of Lebanese who died of famine and disease during the war,
right.
To make claims on the French in that way. I don't know that they would have been successful, except for the fact that the British ambitions, you know, the British wanted Syria too. Lord Curzon really did not want to give up Syria, right? And had their ambitions not been so persistent and so broad and continually, they were expanding their ambitions in the region through the whole process of the Paris Peace Accords. I'm not sure, you know, I don't think the proclamation of a greater Lebanon, separate from Syria, in 1920 would necessarily have occurred, right? The Prime Minister of France was a secular, anti-clerical, anti-colonial.
Right.
It's a great paradox and tragedy of history.
Right.
That he could not rein in the colonial lobby in France. He had no interest really in colonizing Lebanon and Syria. he was interested in a portion of the oil in Mosul, sure,
Right.
for Mosul,
Yeah.
but it was the pressure of the British that gave leverage to the colonial lobby, which was very close to the Maronite Church in Lebanon.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So there's a whole chain of causality there. Without the partnership of the Maronite Church, I don't know that the French could have stabilized their rule in the region.
It was really interesting. Faisal is such a pivotal figure, but yet, when you look at his history between 1920 and 1932, you feel like he wasn't so pivotal after all, because he was cheated all the time. It's almost like he believed the wrong people all the time, and he almost like wishful thinking that yes, things are going to happen this way. Why was he so institutionally and basically, he was liked, but I don't think he was really truly loved by everybody. So why was he such a failure?
He's been considered a failure by people who look backwards from the present back to the past. Why wasn't he like Mustafa Kemal Atatürk?
Right, exactly, yeah, right.
Kicked the Europeans out of Turkey, right?
Correct.
Well, that's easy. He didn't have an army. He didn't have weapons, right? The British and the French were in occupation of the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
Mustafa Kemal was able to organize an army in areas of Anatolia where the Allies had not landed.
That's
and
correct.
He happened to have a spare army up on the Russian border. So that doesn't go to Faisal's personality or any personal flaws. He was dealing with a very difficult situation, right? The question was, could you use the legal process set in motion at Paris to the advantage of the Arabs through a politics of what I came to understand really is more analogous to what Gandhi was trying to do in India, of non-cooperation.
Right.
And a good number of the veterans of the Syrian Arab Congress in 1920 would return to Palestine and practice exactly a Gandhian non-cooperation against the British mandate, right? So you had a choice to do that, or a choice to go to Paris and try to negotiate, right? And that's the choice that Faisal made. He actually, in retrospect, there are historians who defend his deal with Clemenceau in January of 1920 as the best possible deal, given the circumstances that you could make, right? But there were those on the ground who were, favored the other approach of non-cooperation. So they were the more educated people in Syria. They had a bone to pick and they were very bitter. And we have received a history that scapegoated the personality of Faisal and did not really look at the larger structural political problem that a people without a strong army at a time when really it was guns who created states still, it was not laws. Like you can even look in Europe. How did the Poles get Poland? They had an army, right? How did the Czechs get Czechoslovakia? And, so that was the question really for Faisal.
There was a state declared, they wrote a constitution, and they really wanted to establish a constitutional monarchy. How real was that, do you think? Was Faisal going to allow it to be a constitutional monarchy?
Who would allow it?
Faisal.
He was defeated. The story of his confrontation with Rashid Ridda, became president of the Congress. It's famous. People recite that story, right? They confront one another. Faisal says, okay, we have declared independence. No need for this Congress anymore. I will take over. He wanted unilateral control over foreign policy and the ability to negotiate with Europeans on his own terms. He didn't want the trouble, as many an absolute ruler today would not want the bother of a legislature, right? And it's Rida who said, no, you are an elected king. We elected you. You are responsible to us. You are not, you know, the old-fashioned dynastic sort of king, you know. And so we have to look to that moment and recognize that Faisal lost, right? That he became the creature of the king, and the devil in the detail is he wavered as we move into the summer of 1920, and he thought, well, maybe I could actually go back to using the Europeans to keep my power. And I think that's what did him in. That's what did him in.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he counted on that, and it didn't come.
But
his March 1920.
Right, but that same scenario, you flip it around from the Congress's point of view, that tells you how serious a broad spectrum of politicians in Syria at that moment were about founding a democratic style government, right?
That's
and
correct.
they stood on, keeping that Congress open and on finishing the drafting of that constitution, despite all the threats that came from Europe and the attempts to interfere by Faisal, and they finished writing it. Right.
Yeah,
so, you know, I was influenced particularly. There's a professor here in town in Washington named Nathan Brown over at George Washington University. He wrote a nice little article after, well, it was before the Iraq War was over, but he was commenting on the weakness of the constitutional regime that was put in place after the American invasion.
Yeah.
You know, and he wrote, you know, you can't, constitutions are durable. They're not real unless they are the product of a real give and take, the process of bargaining between opposing parties. You know, and he pointed to the Constitutional Congress at Philadelphia in 1787, where you had the Federalists, you know, and their opponent, and you finally agree and you sign on the dotted line. Right, the kind of constitutions that in, you know, the late 20th century, our technocratic view of politics produce, where you just write a text and impose it on a people, are not durable, right? But the ones, and so I took care and devoted a whole chapter in the book to showing how these opposing parties stuck to it, you know, over the course of about 10 weeks. You know, they hammered out a 147 article constitution with a full Bill of Rights. And most importantly, may I point out, for I think it will surprise many today, that the Arabs at Damascus disestablished Islam as an official religion of state 8 years before Mustafa Kemal Ataturk did it. But they did it with the consent of religious leaders. That is a game changer, right? And, I mean, the Turks use it today.
And Rashid Rida was the leader at the time, and making that compromise to make the Islam the religion of the ruler, not necessarily the religion of the state.
Exactly.
And you know, Rashid Rida's role was instrumental in all of this, because you know, in enacting that constitution, he kept insisting, okay, repeat this. Let's read this again. Let's redo this. And he was very, very influential in that whole process.
Yes. He and a whole group of people. I mean, he was part of something called the Syrian Union Party that had formed in Cairo in exile. And I think they wrote the first draft of the Constitution.
That's
and
correct,
another Syrian politician, Abdurrahman Shahbandar, was part of that.
Shahbandar was, the foreign minister, yes.
Yeah. And he, well, he was foreign minister, right? And he would be Syria's leading liberal constitutionalist for the next 2 decades, opposing the French mandate, right? He was one of the leaders of the great 1925 revolt, right? But by the 1930s, it was impossible to think about democracy as something that could be Islamic. The two sides had split. And so that's my next project, is to explore the split between liberals and religious leaders, and how that undermined future attempts to establish what we might call a popular democratic regime, right?
Yeah, I look forward to reading that because I like it when you make sure that to point out that Rashid Rida was not necessarily did not necessarily endorse Hassan al-Banna's Muslim Brotherhood ideology.
I don't think so.
He did not, and Hassan al-Banna kept referring to him, but no, that's not what Rashid Rida wanted. Yes.
No, I mean, what seems anathema to Islamic politicians, today, is that Rida firmly believed there was a boundary to the jurisdiction of Islamic law, and that there were issues of public interest that had to be addressed outside of the confines of that law by an elected assembly. He believed very firmly in religious law and where it had jurisdiction, no doubt. And he was a conservative man. He was not, a radical by any stretch. But what Banna did was to do away with those boundaries and argue that all public life had to be ruled by Islamic law, so that even the Syrian Constitution of 1950 stated that legislation should be based on the Sharia.
That's correct. Yeah, right. Yeah. Listen, oh my God, we really went over time. I truly appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for first of all, for writing this book. I tell you, I learned so much from it. I truly appreciate your effort. Thank you for joining me today for answering these questions. And I think we get ourselves some really very nice answers, very nice conversation going. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.